Greetings again. This is Biology 121, the first semester of AP1 at GRCC. I'm Mike Jones. Talk about nervous system 2, the second part of nervous system. This is going to specifically focus on synaptic transmission and action potential propagation. That is the propagation of an action potential. We're going to talk about what that is, from the cell body to the end of the axon, which is known as the axon terminal or terminal bouton, B-O-U-T-O-N. You'll see that name sometimes. Just the end of the axon. So let's talk about some of these things. So we got to talk a little anatomy, of course. If this is anatomy and physiology, so we have to talk about anatomy, of course. What they've done here is they've shown you a particular area of the brain. Now this could be any area of the brain, honestly. You're going to find these cell types. The only cell type that propagates nerve potentials, the kind of cell that you think of when you think of a nerve, when you say nerve cell, what you mean or what you think of is a neuron. And we've talked about some of the anatomy of a neuron, the dendrites, the axon, cell body, etc. There are other non-neuronal cells, and they're pictured here. And this is right out of your book. There are some other cells, of course. Let's talk about oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes myelinate and insulate central nervous system axons. They do the same thing that Schwann cells do in the peripheral nervous system to peripheral nerves. There are some differences. We're going to talk about what those differences are. Right now, they produce the myelin covering for central nervous system cells, but not peripheral nervous system cells. Astrocytes, another cell type, they form the blood-brain barrier. They are what are referred to as pseudopods, wrap around capillaries that provide blood flow to the central nervous system. And they form this thing called the blood-brain barrier, which is very selective about what will get into the brain or the neurons of the central nervous system and what will not be allowed. Other cells called ependymal cells or ependymal cells, sometimes they're referred to. Those are the cells that create cerebral spinal fluid. So they form CSF, and every ventricle of the brain, all 4 ventricles that you have to identify, all of them are aligned with these cells, and all 4 of them create cerebral spinal fluid, and that circulates through the brain, and we'll get into that. And then you have microglial cells. They are the phagocytic cells. They are the immune system representatives in the central nervous system. They're looking for invaders. They're looking for antigens. Antigens are molecules that are presented usually on the outsides of cells or viruses, and these cells are patrolling for those invaders, those foreign invaders. But let's talk about neurons. Neurons communicate with other neurons through the synapse. We've already talked about what the synapse is when we talked about the neuromuscular junction between a motor neuron and the sarcolemma of a muscle, right? There's a synapse there that tells that muscle cell to contract or not contract, whatever the case may be. That's a synapse. A synapse itself is a gap. It is the gap, literal gap between the end of one neuron, so literally the axon of one neuron, and either the dendrite or the cell body of the next neuron. Now, we say the synapse is the gap. Okay, anything before the synapse is referred to as presynaptic, before the synapse. So there is a presynaptic neuron, and then after the synapse, after the gap, there is a postsynaptic neuron. Right? So this receives the impulse. Now, synapses can be excitatory or inhibitory. What I mean by that is the neurotransmitters from the presynaptic neuron can either excite or inhibit the next neuron, the postsynaptic neuron. We're going to talk more about that. All right. Now, synaptic transmission is caused by neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are usually small molecules. They can be derivatives of amino acids, or they can be other types of molecules. They're usually fairly small, and they have to get across that gap. And that's called synaptic transmission. This is one of the things in the nervous system that guarantees a one-way transfer of information. You want neuronal flow, the flow of information, to go from one neuron to the next neuron to the next neuron. You don't want it to go backwards. You want it to go forward. One of the ways you guarantee that is this idea of synaptic transmission. We're going to talk about why that happens. But you notice over here, so this is a terminal bouton, as I've said, or an axon terminal, as it's usually called. At the end of it, there are going to be a lot of these vesicles, where you see these tiny, tiny vesicles. These are called synaptic vesicles. Those vesicles have inside them, they have neurotransmitter that is ready to go. But these synaptic vesicles sit at the end of the axon terminal, and they wait for an appropriate signal telling them to send their neurotransmitter out into the synaptic cleft. What's that signal? The signal that comes down is an action potential. And we're going to talk about exactly how you generate an action potential and what that is. But once that action potential gets to the end of the neuron, it typically will open calcium channels on the end of the neuron. That's what the synaptic, or the action potential allows calcium channels to open at the end of the neuron. When those calcium channels open, that allows calcium in, of course. Calcium floods into the end of the neuron. And that causes this synaptic vesicle to fuse with the membrane at the end of the synapse. That's called exocytosis. Now, this is an energetic process. It requires ATP. You have to have ATP. That's what the mitochondria are for, right? You have this mitochondria in here. Remember, mitochondria make ATP. That's the energy currency of a cell. Action potential comes down here, opens up calcium channels. Calcium floods in. That allows this synaptic vesicle to fuse with the end of the membrane. That releases its neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. That requires ATP to do that. That's why you have mitochondria. That's the process. Now, this neurotransmitter is in the synaptic cleft. What then? What happens then? It has to travel across this tiny gap. And it's a tiny gap. It's 20 nanometers or so, 10 to 20 nanometers. It's a very, very short gap. But still, it's a gap. This neurotransmitter has to go across that gap, diffuse across the gap. It attaches to specific receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. This is, if you recall your muscle physiology, this is exactly what happens with acetylcholine crossing the synaptic cleft and attaching to acetylcholine receptors. It's the same process in the rest of the nervous system. Now, that will either have, so acetylcholine at the end of a motor neuron attaches to the sarcolemma. That has an excitatory action on the sarcolemma, and it causes a depolarization of the sarcolemma, and that causes muscle contraction. You already know that. You already studied that. The difference here is that this neurotransmitter from one neuron to the next neuron could have an excitatory effect or an inhibitory effect. It may disallow a continuation of that nerve signal to the next cell. And in fact, most neurotransmitters are inhibitory. You might think that seems kind of strange, but in fact, if all neurotransmitters were excitatory, they would, once an action potential was generated in one neuron, that would generate an action potential in the next, and the next, and the next, and the next. You would never have any way of modulating that information. So you don't want to have all synaptic transmissions to be excitatory. And in fact, as I say, most of them are actually inhibitory. And that allows for what we refer to as modulation of the nervous system. Okay, so in order for an action potential to be sent, you have to polarize the cell membrane. That's referred to as a cell membrane potential. So a potential is nothing different than a battery. I have a battery here, somewhere along here. Ah, here's a battery. Hang on, I'm coming back. Here I am. Look, a battery. I did all that work for just to find a battery. Great. A battery is something that holds a charge. It holds a potential. Potential means this battery could be used to power other things. It has the potential to do that. And in a physics sense, what we mean is there is a separation of charge inside this battery that gives it a voltage, or at least a potential voltage. And that is because of this unequal distribution of ions. There's an unequal distribution of ions on one side of the battery versus the other side of the battery. When we're talking about cell membranes, we're talking about an unequal distribution of ions across the cell membrane. That creates an electric charge. We refer to that as a polarized membrane. And a polarized membrane has to be the default state of a nerve, so that it is ready to carry a charge down the axon to the next neuron. Right, so we call that cell membrane potential. That is called a polarized neuron. We're going to talk about how that happens. Again, I'm going to refer back to the motor neuron interacting with the sarcolemma of the muscle. These are polarized neurons. These are polarized membranes that are ready to fire. We're going to talk about how we get there. Okay, so we have to talk about the various parts of a neuron. Remember, you have dendrites. Typically, a neuron, most of the neurons that we're going to talk about are going to have lots of dendrites. Those dendrites may attach directly to the cell body. The cell body of a neuron is where the nucleus is. There are other structures here too, but typically we're talking about where the nucleus is. That's the cell body. Most neurons are going to have one axon. And this is an axon. What that means is it receives information. Any typical neuron receives information from lots of different other neurons. Once it takes that information and then it makes a decision. I'm going to make it sound like, it's making some sort of brainiac decision here. But it takes all this information in, and then it has to either propagate that signal down its axon, and it has one axon. Most nerves have one axon. It has to propagate that nerve signal down the axon, or it doesn't. So we refer to this as an all or none phenomena. If it receives enough input that says, yes, go ahead, fire, it will send that action potential down to the ends of that axon. So this would be the terminal bouton, or the axon terminal, as the nomenclature may be. The important segment of any neuron is this segment here, called the initial segment or the initiating segment, where all of these signals are kind of summarized. And in some ways, it is kind of a mathematical equation. All of the inputs that this nerve cell receives, some of them are going to be inhibitory, some are excitatory. When we add them all up, if we get an overall excitatory stimulus, we'll say, yep, send an action potential down the road to the next neuron. If they are inhibitory signals, for the most part, the effect of that will be, don't send a signal down. But once the signal is sent, it can't be stopped. It goes on. And you get release of neurotransmitter on the end. Right. Let's talk about more of these segments. So you have the receptive segment, meaning these are the receivers. These receive inputs from other neurons in the nervous system. On average, any neuron in the central nervous system, on average, receives about 1,000 inputs. That means 1,000 other neurons touch this neuron, either in the dendrites or in the cell body. And these other 1,000 neurons are telling this neuron, yes, go ahead and fire, or no, don't fire. Once it receives enough of those signals to fire, the initial segment fires, sends an action potential down to the axon terminal. So that's a lot of input into one cell. All right, how does it do this? You have to understand, I'm going to have to move me so I get out of the way. There I am. Okay. We talked about an unequal distribution of ions across the cell membrane of a nerve cell. Yes. How does that happen? Most of the unequal distribution occurs because of this thing called the sodium-potassium pump. It's sometimes referred to as the sodium-potassium ATPase. The reason it's called that is because ATP is necessary. That means energy. Energy is necessary to distribute sodium and potassium in an unequal measure. What you find on a nerve cell that is ready to go, you find a lot of sodium on the outside and not much sodium inside the cell membrane. But you will find very little potassium outside that cell membrane, but a lot of potassium on the inside of a neuron. When we talk about an unequal distribution of ions, that's the major inequality that we're talking about. A lot of sodium on the outside, a lot of potassium on the inside. That is created predominantly by the sodium-potassium pump. Whenever we use this word pump, we are talking about an energetic process that requires energy to set this stage. So that's what nerves do. Nerves use energy to separate these ions, sodium on the outside, potassium on the inside. And that is a nerve that is ready to fire. The firing process itself does not use energy at all. You're going to see that in a minute. All right. Now, one of the things one of the other things that you have to be aware of are these things called ion channels. Ion channels are proteins. They are proteins that sit inside a cell membrane, but they are very specific for a particular ion. So you have what are called calcium channels. You have sodium channels. You have potassium channels. These channels, these ion channels, are specific for that very specific ion. Not for every ion, for that particular ion. They're very important to understand the process of creating a depolarization for this action potential to spread down the axon. Now, the opening and closing of these channels happens usually and often in the nerve cell, often because of a voltage dependency. What does that mean? That simply means that if I change the voltage in one part of a membrane, that will either open or close a particular ion channel. And when these things open or close, they open for a very short amount of time, but it's enough amount of time to allow the ion either to go into the cell or out of the cell. So they're showing you a picture here, right, of a protein, an ion channel in a cell membrane. This one's closed, but if it gets the signal to open, this is what it'll do. It'll open up and allows ion to either flow in or flow out. Now you may look at this situation and you say, well, so what? Ions flow in, ions flow out. What's the big deal? This is the big deal. Batteries work exactly the same way. We separate charges. Now they're not sodium and potassium, but the principle is the same. We take charges, ions, and we separate them, and we put a barrier in between those two ions. And then when we connect the two ends of a battery together, we're allowing that ion to flow through a circuit. And so it is with nerve cells. Nerve cells work the same way. We separate charges, and then at the right moment, we open channels to allow an ion to flow in or flow out of a neuron, and that creates a charge. And that allows the flow of a charge down the axon. So the principle is the same. Now, when we separate these charges, we have a lot of sodium on the outside and a lot of potassium on the inside, and that is formed by the sodium-potassium ATPase, or sodium-potassium pump, if you prefer that terminology. Same thing. When we separate these ions, what we get is what we call a resting membrane potential. Now, a resting potential means in this particular thing, right, you have a battery. This particular battery is rated at 1.5 volts. 1.5 volts simply means that we have a separation of charge that allows a potential difference, an electrical potential difference of 1.5 volts. Well, certainly in a neuron, you don't have that much voltage, but still the separating of charges results in a potential difference, and that results in a voltage measurement that we can measure that. We can measure the difference in voltage from outside a neuron to the inside of a neuron. And this is it. 70 millivolts. 70 millivolts is the difference of charge distribution from the outside to the inside of a neuron. Now, we always measure the voltage difference from the inside compared to the outside. And so what this does is the resting membrane potential, this RMP value, is reported in physiology everywhere as a negative 70 millivolts. So the inside of the cell is negative relative to the outside of the cell. How much negative? Negative 70. Negative 70 millivolts. So that's just thousandths of a volt. And you might say, well, what's the big deal? Well, that's enough for a neuron to work. That's what you need. And this is set up by the sodium-potassium ATPase that kicks sodium outside the cell and brings potassium inside the cell. That results in a negative 70 millivolt difference because of the unequal charge distribution. We call that the resting membrane potential. All right, so let's look at a nerve. Here's one nerve cell, right? Here's the cell body. Here are the dendrites. Remember, dendrites receive information. Axon sends out information to the axon terminal. All right, so what does the sodium potassium ATPase do? It kicks out sodium out of the cell and cell body, and the dendrites too, and the axon too. It kicks sodium out. So you're going to have a high concentration of sodium outside the cell. You're going to have a high concentration of potassium inside the cell. Right? So they're showing you, here's where a nerve starts. Right? This is a nerve that it has not achieved its resting membrane potential. All right, we move to the next slide. As we move on, now we have generated the resting membrane potential by the sodium-potassium pump, kicking sodium out and bringing potassium in. So that means Na+, that's sodium. Na+, outside. K+, that's potassium. I know these letters are weird. K+ is on the inside. All right? That sets up this highly positive outer charge and a highly negative inner charge. And we measure this, and if we measure this potential difference, we say that it is a negative 70 millivolt difference. More negative on the inside than the outside. All right. This is the resting membrane potential. Resting. Think of the word resting. It's ready to go. This is a nerve cell that is ready to fire, but it is resting. It has received no other input to do anything. It's ready to go, but it's not doing anything yet. All right. Now we move forward. This is how we generated that. Here's the pump, our sodium potassium pump. Pump always means, in physiology, always means you're using energy of ATP that you generate. And what are you using it for? You're using it to kick sodium out of the cell, and you're using it to bring potassium into the cell. That's how you generate the negative 70 millivolt resting membrane potential. Great. You're ready to go. Okay, now what? Well, you need to, that is what we refer to, that neuron. Let me go back. This neuron is referred to as a polarized cell. Right? It's ready to go, and it is polarized. It's charged, if you will. All right, now how are we going to make it send information to the next neuron? Well, we have to depolarize it. Now, there's actually two things that can happen here. You can depolarize the cell, so it says right here, right? If membrane potential becomes less negative, the membrane is depolarized. That means it sits there at negative 70. Negative 70 means it's more negative on the inside than the outside, okay? If you make it negative 75, negative 80, negative 85, you are hyperpolarizing that membrane. What does that mean? That means it's less likely to be able to send an action potential to the next nerve. If you hyperpolarize it, you make it less likely to send a signal. Okay? If you depolarize it, you make it more likely to send a signal. Depolarizing means you take it from its resting membrane potential of negative 70, then you move it to negative 65, negative 60. And there is a number. If you reach this magic number, you will send an action potential down the axon. The magic number is negative 55. So if it's sitting there at negative 70, right? We looked at the terminology. That's called resting. That means it's just waiting. If we depolarize that membrane to negative 60, or negative 70, negative 65, negative 60, negative 55, ding, 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 negative 55, it hits negative 55. You will send an action potential down the axon of that nerve cell. Guaranteed. This is why we call it all or none. Now, if you're sitting there at the resting membrane potential, negative 70, if you get to negative 65, negative 60, but you don't hit the magic number of -55, then you do not send an action potential down the axon. This is why it's called all or none. If you make it to -55, you send a signal. If you do not make it to -55, meaning if you depolarize the membrane to anything less than -55, it's not going to send an action potential. Now, if it's anything, if you sit at -70 and you go to -65, that's called depolarization. That's called a local potential. That means a small part of the membrane changes its battery power, if you will. But it's not enough to send a signal down the rest of the axon. On the other hand, if you hyperpolarize it, that is what inhibitory neurotransmitters will do. They hyperpolarize the membrane. They take it from -70 to -75 to -80. You're making it much less likely that you're going to send a signal down that axon. All right. Now, here is what we call an action potential, a recording of an action potential. Let's look at our axes, okay? On the x-axis is time. Now, it's a very short amount of time, milliseconds, but it doesn't matter. It's still time. The y-axis here is membrane potential as measured in millivolts. I told you already, sodium-potassium pump creates a unequal ion distribution between sodium and potassium that results in a resting membrane potential of -70 millivolts in any neuron. Okay, so here it is, right? This thing's resting at -70 millivolts. I'm going to repeat this again. I know you already know this, but I'm going to say it again. -70 means the inside of the cell is negative relative to the outside of the cell. So we say it's a -70 millivolt resting membrane potential. Great. All right, we come along and we give it a little stimulus. So there's other nerve cells that are providing input into our particular nerve. They provide that input. They give it a little bump. All right. Now, what we're doing here is from here, we are creating a depolarization of the membrane. But we have not yet met the threshold stimulus. Threshold stimulus is -55. I told you that. If you don't get to -55, you will not get what we refer to as an action potential. That means the nerve won't fire. However, if you get a little bit of a bump up, if you get enough of a bump, this mark right here, right in there, means that's about at -55. At -55, the magic occurs. All on its own, this nerve will now go through the process of depolarization. Depolarization simply means we're sending an action potential down the axon to the next nerve down the road. That's called depolarization. If you've depolarized it sufficiently, you get an action potential. If you do not depolarize it enough, let's say you depolarize it from -70 millivolts to -60 millivolts, that's not enough. It would simply return back down to its normal level. It would not send an action potential. You would not get propagation of that nerve signal. But in this case, we're going to say, yep, we made it to -55. That's the magic number. Magic number, boom, off we go. We get a depolarization of that axon. But if you're depolarizing something, in order to bring it back to where it was, you have to repolarize it. So we depolarize it in a very short amount of time, and then we repolarize it in a very short amount of time. Your nerve cells sort of overshoot, right? They do too much of a good thing. The repolarization process takes you into what we call hyperpolarization. That means we go even lower in terms of the membrane potential. We go even lower than we used to be at. So it used to be at negative 70. Well, maybe we go to negative 75. Maybe in some cases, maybe even to negative 80. That is a hyperpolarization. That means that this membrane at this point cannot fire again. There's really two periods we're going to talk about in the next few slides. All right, we hyperpolarize the membrane, and then we bring it back to the resting membrane potential. We're ready to go again. Okay, so that takes about, right, so we're saying here at 1 millisecond, we stimulate this nerve cell. Boom, we stimulate it enough to get an action potential. You get a depolarization cycle, a repolarization cycle, hyperpolarization. We return back to the resting membrane potential. This takes us anywhere from 3 to 5 milliseconds, 3 to 5 thousandths of a second. Bam, super quick. But we can measure it. So we're going to look at it. Here's two things that could happen to any particular nerve cell. Here's a nerve cell that is not going to send an action potential to the next nerve. Right? We're going to send some signals in from other nerve cells. Some of these neurotransmitters come across this membrane and they cause a little bit of local depolarization, but not enough to create an action potential. So how do we measure that? We say, well, the resting membrane potential is negative 70. We provide a couple of inputs from neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters provide a little bit of depolarization of the membrane, but not enough depolarization. So we go from negative 70 to maybe negative 60. That's not enough. We haven't met threshold potential. It's not enough. It goes back down to normal resting membrane potential. No action potential. Right? We would consider this a local membrane change or a local potential. All right, now we're going to go to the second case. All right, let's say every one of these inputs from some other neuron sends an excitatory neurotransmitter across the synapse to the dendrite or the cell body of the receiving cell. That causes enough of a depolarization to get to the magic number. What's the magic number again? Negative 55. When you get to negative 55, bam! You go through the cycle of depolarization and repolarization, hyperpolarization, and recovery of normal resting membrane potential. That is called an action potential. You have now sent, meaning this cell, this nerve cell, this neuron has sent an action potential to the next cell down the road. How does that happen? All right, now we're going to get more specific about exactly how that happens. So we talked about these ion channels. Now we're going to talk about specific ion channels in the initiating segment of a neuron and in the axon of these same neurons. All right, we start with a neuron at rest. At rest means it is the resting membrane potential is negative 70 millivolts. Great. So this thing's sitting here, it's negative 70 millivolts. Here's a graph. Perfect. Negative 70. Yep. All right. Now we're going to assume that I provided enough stimulation to this nerve cell to get it to fire. What does that mean? That means I'm going to send an action potential down this axon to the next nerve down the road. All right. Now, what does that mean on a molecular level? First thing that happens is the sodium ion channels. That means that proteins that are specific for sodium open up, right? They open up along the initiating segment, and they open up along the axon in a very small area, very, very small area of those parts of the neuron. What does that mean? Sodium channels open. Remember, sodium is in high concentration on the outside of the neuron, low concentration on the inside. Now you have to think about chemistry. What does that mean? If I have a high concentration and a low concentration, my ions, if they can, the ions are going to try to flow from the outside to the inside. But they're going to go down their concentration gradient, as you would expect, because chemistry says that must happen. Okay, so they do. So the sodium channels open. Sodium channel opens, boom. Only sodium can go in. Sodium goes from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. What does that do? That takes positive charge from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. That is called depolarization. Right, I'm depolarizing. Depolarization, according to the curve that I showed you, the graph that I showed you in the last slide, that is the part of the curve that goes way up real fast. That's the depolarization. That is represented by sodium entering the axon. So that's called depolarization. However, I haven't said anything about the potassium channels because they're not doing anything yet. These are just sodium channels. Sodium channels open up and allow sodium to flow down its concentration gradient from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. That's called depolarization. Great. Very shortly after that, within milliseconds, the potassium channels open. Right, so sodium flows in first, and then after that, but decidedly after that, the potassium channels open, and now potassium can flow out. Remember, it's in high concentration inside the neuron, inside the axon. It's in low concentration outside. So it wants to flow down its concentration gradient. That part of the action potential is called the repolarization part. All right, so -70 is resting membrane potential. That is set up by the sodium-potassium pump. When you achieve threshold stimulus, the first thing that happens is sodium channels open. They allow sodium to flow from the outside to the inside. That is called depolarization. The next step, a few milliseconds later, but it's always later, a few milliseconds later, the potassium channels open, and they allow potassium to go from the inside of the neuron to the outside. That is called repolarization. These are the two parts of the curve. Well, three parts, I guess we're getting at. Right? Resting membrane potential is down here. Depolarization, sodium goes in because the sodium channels open. Repolarization occurs because potassium channels open and allow potassium to go out. The potassium channels are a little too good at their job. They allow a little bit more potassium to come to exit the cell than they should. That causes something that's referred to as hyperpolarization. I showed you that on the last graph. You need the sodium-potassium ATPase, the sodium-potassium pump, to reestablish the regular resting membrane potential of -70 millivolts. That takes a little time. How much time does it take? Well, let's look back at this graph. Where's my graph? It takes this amount of time. It takes about from 2 to 2.5 milliseconds. So half a millisecond for depolarization to occur. It takes another half a millisecond, maybe a little bit more, for repolarization to occur. Potassium channels open. They do too good of a job. They hyperpolarize the membrane. Sodium-potassium ATPase reestablishes regular resting membrane potential. So this whole process takes you anywhere from 3 to 5 milliseconds to occur. All of it. Boom. Super fast. Now, the only place where an action potential matters, or an action potential starts, is what we call the initial segment, sometimes referred to as the trigger zone, sometimes referred to as the axon hillock. That means that is the very start of the axon. And remember, there's a lot of dendrites, and there's one cell body, and there is one axon. Axons take neuronal signals away from the cell body onto the axon terminal. Dendrites bring information from other neurons into the cell body. It's the axon hillock that matters the most. If that gets to the negative 55, magic number, negative 55 millivolts, you will get an action potential every time. If you don't make it to negative 55 millivolts at the axon hillock, you will not get an action potential. That is called the all or none principle. Now you can get smaller electrical potentials, differentials and potentials in all the dendrites and all the cell and along the cell body. But those are called local potentials. An action potential is in an axon, and an action potential refers to the propagation of the electrical signal from that particular neuron to the next neuron. Anything short of an action potential is a local potential. Now you can get depolarization of a small segment or hyperpolarization of a small segment. But in order to get propagation of the signal, they have to add up to the magic negative 55 millivolts at the axon hillock, or the initial segment, or the trigger zone. It's all the same thing. Okay? Once you get an action potential, the depolarization part is sodium coming in from the outside to the inside because the sodium channel is open. Repolarization occurs because potassium channels open after the sodium channels have opened, and they allow potassium to go from the high concentration inside the neuron to the outside of the neuron. Now, once you're in that situation, you have a high concentration inside the neuron of sodium and a high concentration of potassium outside. Well, that's not a resting membrane potential. That's an action potential. Now you have to reestablish the resting membrane potential. How do you do that? We go back to like the very first thing, or one of the very first things that I said in this lecture. You have to use the sodium potassium pump to reestablish negative 70 millivolts as your resting membrane potential. And that's what we're getting at here. Active transport reestablishes the resting membrane potential because of the sodium potassium pump. Now that thing is ready to go again. I told you that takes maybe 5 milliseconds to occur. Every 5 milliseconds, that nerve can fire. Bam, 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 bam. Different nerves have a different recovery time, but that's an overall average. So here it is again, right? Here's the region of the action potential. What does that mean? Sodium channels open, sodium flows in. So you're getting positive charges to go into the axon. There is a brief period in which you cannot get this part of the axon to fire again. And we break it up into two time frames or time periods in which you can't fire this neuron again. The reason that's important, and one of the implications of this, is exactly what it says here, the direction of conduction. If you cannot make this part of the axon depolarize again right away, you're going to make the next segment down depolarize. and the next segment, and the next segment, and the next segment, and the next segment. But it means you cannot make the previous segment depolarize again immediately. And that's important for the propagation of a nerve signal. You want that nerve signal to go from one neuron to the next neuron to the next neuron. You don't want it coming backwards. And the way that these action potentials are generated guarantees that you cannot get a backflow of nerve information. It always goes in one direction. All right, so here's the summary. Nerve cell membrane maintains a resting potential because of the diffusion of sodium out, potassium inside. Right, that's a resting membrane potential. Once you allow sodium to flow in, because the sodium channel is open, that's the first part, that's depolarization. The next part is repolarization because potassium channel's open. But it has to happen in that order. Once they diffuse out, that's called repolarization. Now, you have this repolarized membrane, but potassium and sodium are in the wrong place. Sodium-potassium pump reestablishes the gradient. Off you go again. Here we are, negative 70 millivolts. This is just another way of looking at it. Resting membrane potential. You get graded potentials. Graded potentials can get you closer to that negative 55 magic number. But if they don't make it there, well, then you're destined to fail. You're not going to get an action potential. But if we get enough graded potentials, or if we get enough addition of those potentials, what do we get? We make it to negative 55, boom, then we get depolarization, sodium channels open. Repolarization, potassium channels open. Hyperpolarization, potassium channels stayed open a little longer than they needed to, but they do that to make sure that we don't get a backflow, we don't get an action potential going in the wrong direction. We get sodium-potassium pump to reestablish where sodium ought to be and where potassium ought to be. We're ready to go again. Boom. Right? So this graph even shows you, like, here's the impulse, the input, ready in maybe 2+ milliseconds. 2 to 3 milliseconds. We're ready to go again. That's fast. That's very, very fast. This is referred to an action potential as an all or none response. Now, I want to make sure that you understand the difference between a graded potential. A graded potential is a local area potential that moves toward that negative 55 number, but you don't make it to the negative 55. And remember, again, I'm going to beat this into your heads. It's the important part is what happens at the axon hillock, or the initiating segment of any particular neuron. If that axon hillock makes it to negative 55, you get an action potential down that axon. If you don't make it to negative 55 at the axon hillock, doesn't matter what else is happening in the dendrites or the cell body, you don't make it to negative 55, you do not get propagation of a signal. That particular principle of how nerves work is called all or none response. You either get propagation of the signal down the axon, called an action potential, or you don't. Once you get an action potential, the action potential from one moment to the next moment to the next moment to the next moment, all of those action potentials are exactly the same. There's no strength difference in an action potential. An action potential is an all or none. You get all of it and it propagates, or you get none. So then you say, well, how do I get a variation in a signal strength? What we mean by signal strength is, if I were to say, push on my palm, I can feel pressure. But if I take a needle, I'll take a pen, right? If I take a pen and push, if I push hard enough, all of a sudden I go, ooh, ouch, that hurts. Why did that hurt and this didn't hurt? That has to do with how many signals per second am I sending through that nerve. The more signals, that's called frequency. The frequency of nerve stimulus tells you the intensity of the response. All right, if I'm pushing with this, my finger pushes into my palm. If I push that way, I will get a frequency of maybe 10 to 20 times a second. Right, so the nerves in my palm are sensing my finger. Boom, I push. I can push hard 20 times a second. Ding, ding, ding. My brain says, 20 times a second. That's fine. We're good. Everything's fine. Take this thing. It's pointier. Okay? It could do more damage. So I poke it in there. If I poke it lightly, it's not so bad. As I start to increase the amount of pressure that I'm putting in, my nerves that are receiving that signal go from 10 times a second to 20 times a second to 30 to 40 to 50 times a second as they send more and more and more signals. And that is called the higher frequency. The more signals they send per second, that's where my brain starts to pay attention. My brain says, whoa, 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 what's happening out there? That's not, oh, no, no, no. That could cause me some damage. That could be a problem. That could be an issue. We need to pay attention to that. It is the frequency of action potentials, the number of impulses per second. Not any one impulse, but how many per second I'm getting. That's increased signal intensity. Okay, so we talked about this. We talked about this, but we didn't put names on it. There's two parts to an action potential. Right? You get that. Well, you get the depolarization phase, you get repolarization, you get hyperpolarization. During the repolarization and hyperpolarization phase, there are two parts where you can break that up. The first part is what we call an absolute refractory period. That just simply means that nerve cannot, under any circumstances, generate another action potential. It doesn't matter how hard you push it, how pointed the needle is, it doesn't matter. You cannot get that particular nerve to fire again. That's called an absolute refractory period. The next thing that happens is what we call the relative refractory period. You're only going to get that nerve to fire with a higher intensity stimulus. That means if I take this pen and I push it on my palm, and at first I might feel a little bit of pressure and I might feel tenderness or maybe even pain. But if I don't push it any harder, my hand, the nerves where that pinpoint is, the nerves where the pinpoint is, will get used to it and they'll say, oh, okay, it's fine. So they will actually go up to 10, 20, 30 times per second, and then they'll go back down. If I push harder, I am increasing the intensity of the stimulus. If I increase the intensity, right, if I increase it to a high intensity stimulus, I may be able to generate another action potential. And that would mean that the action potentials would happen at a faster rate. So if I push this in a little bit, it's no big deal. If I push harder and harder and harder and harder and harder, I am increasing the intensity of the stimulus, and that can increase the number of signals that particular nerve is sending to my brain at any given time. That is, and what that means is I'm increasing the signal stimulus intensity. If I do that, I am affecting the nerve by making it fire during its relative refractory period. That will send a signal to my brain, my central nervous system. There's more and more and more stimulus out there. Again, you need to pay attention to this. This could be a problem. this thing may cause my skin damage. I don't know if the next thing, yes, okay, this is what I wanted to show you. So this part, this is a, resting membrane potential. We get graded potentials. We hit threshold stimulus. We get an action potential. The absolute refractory period is from the time that I get any kind of stimulus to give me an action potential in that nerve, in that axon. So right at the beginning and into just about the maximum of the depolarization phase, that is considered the absolute refractory period. I cannot get any kind of, I can't get that nerve to fire again, no matter what I do. It doesn't matter what I do. Even into its recovery phase, right, into a portion of the repolarization phase, I still can't get that nerve to fire again. Right? It's firing right now. I can't get it to fire again. So that's the absolute refractory period. It's only when I get down into the hyperpolarization phase, into here, I can get maybe some ability to get this particular nerve to fire again. Now, I point out to you, we're talking about here's 0 milliseconds. Here's 1 millisecond. Here's 2 milliseconds. We're talking about 1.5 to 2 milliseconds. That means that in any given second, I might be able to get more than 100, more than 200 impulses in a single nerve. But I can't get more than that. No matter what I do, I can't make a nerve fire more because it simply has to fire and it has to recover and it has to repolarize and then it's ready to go again. That's how nerves work. That's how we guarantee a particular direction of nerve impulse, and that's how we guarantee that we cannot get a higher intensity of signal, a higher frequency of signal than the period of time where it takes the nerve to recover from its first round of firing. Okay, so we've already talked about, okay, we get an action potential. We get sodium channels opening first, and then shortly after that, potassium channels open, and that's in a small segment of the axon, and then that moves on down to the next segment, the next segment, the next segment. As that propagation of signal moves to the next segment, the previous segment cannot fire again because it is in its absolute refractory period. And then it recovers, but that propagation of signal goes from the one segment to the next, to the next, to the next. Great. It's moving on down the axon. Okay. Now, the speed with which that action potential can go down an axon can be influenced by a variety of conditions. The first one is myelination. If you myelinate a neuron, it will propagate a signal faster than an unmyelinated neuron. Just accept that as fact. I mean, I'll explain it to you a little bit in the next slide, but myelin acts like an electrical insulator. It allows the electrical signal to be propagated from one segment of a neuron to the next segment, to the next segment, to the next, to the next. We refer to that as saltatory conduction. That means it jumps. It jumps from one segment to the next segment, to the next, to the next, to the next. That jumpy conduction is actually faster than if it had to go all the way through a single axon. So, a myelinated neuron transmits a signal faster than an unmyelinated neuron. All right, that's fact number one. Fact number two in impulse conduction is the diameter of the axon. Yes, how fat is that thing? It turns out that a fatter neuron, that means a bigger diameter neuron, transmits signals faster than a small diameter neuron. I'm not going to get into the physics of that. You just have to accept it from me that that is truth. Thick axons transmit faster than thin axons. Okay, so if we put these two things together, the fastest axons in your body, for example, motor neurons. Motor neurons have thick, myelinated axons. So their signals travel pretty fast, as much as 120 meters a second. It's pretty quick. Considering you might be 2 meters tall, 120 millimeters or 120 meters a second, it's pretty fast. On the other hand, thin, smaller diameter, unmyelinated axons. Now these tend to be more like pain fibers. Well, I won't get into my whole soapbox lecture on pain, but we get into this idea of nociception, and nociception is nerves that sense the possibility of damage to the body. That's called nociception. Those kind of neurons tend to transmit signals fairly slowly. They're thin and they're unmyelinated. 1/2 to 1 meter per second. So that's relatively slow, right? So bottom line, thick myelinated axons transmit signals faster. Thin unmyelinated axons transmit signals more slowly. Now, I want to point out the difference here. When we talk about myelin, we're talking about there are cells in the peripheral nervous system on the left, PNS, and there are cells in the central nervous system, and both of these cells form myelin. But it's different cells, and they do it differently. And you may be questioned about this. And so we have myelin sheath formed by what's called a Schwann cell in the peripheral nervous system. Any individual Schwann cell, they're also called neurolemmacytes. Neurolemmacytes, any individual cell forms a small piece of a more substantial myelination on any peripheral nerve cell. So here's a neurolemmacyte, here's a neurolemmacyte, here's a neurolemmacyte, also known as a Schwann cell. Schwann cell, Schwann cell. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 individual Schwann cells forming the myelin sheath on this particular axon in the peripheral nervous system. Let's change over to the central nervous system. The central nervous system, the cells that form a myelin sheath in the central nervous system are called oligodendrocytes. Different cell, a different glial cell. These are glial cells. But they do it differently, right? One oligodendrocyte will form several sections of a myelin sheath on several different neurons. Over here you had one cell that forms one section on one neuron. Over here in the central nervous system you have one cell that forms several different sections on potentially several different neurons. It's the same idea that you're covering it with myelin, and myelin is this fatty tissue that allows the nerve signal to propagate more rapidly. This is how saltatory conduction works. If you have myelin, and it doesn't matter, central, peripheral nervous system works the same. You have this fatty layer of myelin. The action potential comes in on this side, and now the bioelectric current, I'm not going to get into the physics of this. You have to understand that current doesn't need to cause a depolarization in the membrane. the current can be transferred on down to the next node. Now we call these nodes, we call them nodes of Ranvier. Right? Ranvier, R-A-N-V-I-E-R. French word, Ranvier. But from one neuronal node to the next neuronal node to the next neuronal node, that's essentially how this action potential jumps from node to node to node. That happens faster than it would take that action potential to actually move from this part of the nerve to that part of the nerve without that cell there. It just happens faster. That is called saltatory conduction. All right, now we're getting into synapses. All right, synapses are where the action's at, right? You got a nerve that's propagating a signal down its axon, goes to the axon terminal. How are you going to get it to go to the next axon? Synaptic transmission, right? So you have to get chemicals inside a synaptic vesicle. You've already seen this with muscles, right? You have synaptic vesicles with acetylcholine as far as muscles go. The motor neuron and action potential travels down the motor neuron. It allows calcium into the axon terminus. That causes the synaptic vesicle to fuse with its end membrane, and that releases, in the muscle case, it releases acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. That acetylcholine has to cross the synaptic cleft, small distance, but it's still got to go across. It has to bind with its receptors on the other side. It's the same way in nerves. It works the same way. But the neurotransmitters are different. The receptors are different. But the process is similar. All right? So the effects of neurotransmitters vary. Some open ion channels, other closed ion channels. Chemically gated ion channels respond to neurotransmitters. It's the same thing with acetylcholine onto its acetylcholine receptor on the sarcolemma. Well, just replace sarcolemma with postsynaptic membrane. And as I've already mentioned to you, that neurotransmitters come in two big varieties. One is excitatory neurotransmitters. That means they pass, they're making it more likely that the next cell down the road is going to depolarize and fire its action potential. On the other hand, there's others. Inhibitory neurotransmitters make it less likely. What do? They hyperpolarize the membrane. So we call them, based on whether they're excitatory or inhibitory, we call them excitatory postsynaptic potentials or inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. I've already told you that any particular nerve, this is especially true in the central nervous system, you have on the order of 1,000 inputs, right? Any nerve in your central nervous system has 1,000 inputs from other nerves, other neurons. All right, well, let's add it up. If 700 of those 1,000 are excitatory and 300 are inhibitory, well, you have more excitatory than you have inhibitory. It's more likely that you're going to get an action potential. It's more likely that you're going to make the initial segment or the trigger zone fire. So trigger zone fires, you get an action potential. All right, great. If, on the other hand, you have 700 inhibitory signals and 300 excitatory signals, there's more inhibitory than excitatory. You hyperpolarize the membrane, you make it less likely to send a potential on down the road, and so you're not going to get a continuation of the action potential. That's more or less how any particular nerve decides to pass on an action potential. More excitatory, it passes it on. More inhibitory, it doesn't pass it on. What does that mean? Excitatory means you're more likely to create a depolarization in the next nerve. inhibitory, you're more likely to create a hyperpolarization in the next nerve. So you have to understand this terminology. You have to understand how the cell membrane works. You have to understand the potential differences. This has a name. Of course it has a name. It's called summation. So I just went through the process. EPSP, excitatory postsynaptic potential, excitatory postsynaptic potential. That means that that particular neuron, the neurotransmitter at the end of that neuron, excited the next neuron down the road. Now it excited the dendrite, it excited the cell body, whatever. But these have to summate. You have to have enough excitatory inputs to get an action potential to continue on down. If you don't, or if you have a lot of inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, you will not get an action. And again, we can get local gradients, local effects. But if you want to talk about an action potential going down a neuron's axon, that is what we refer to as all or none. It either happens or it doesn't. Now, neurotransmitters come in lots of different varieties, but we can pretty much summarize them into they're either excitatory or they're inhibitory. They come in all different shapes and sizes. We've already talked about to death. Acetylcholine. Acetylcholine stimulates skeletal muscle contraction. It would be considered an excitatory neurotransmitter. It would cause an excitatory postsynaptic potential. Great. Not all of them do. There's lots of different variations on neurotransmitters. They come in different shapes, different sizes, but they're either excitatory or they are inhibitory. And they have to be brought in the cytoplasm of the neuron. They have to be brought down to the axon terminus, or the terminal bouton, as it's sometimes called. That's where it has its effect. It's released by exocytosis. You already know this. We've been through that process. I believe that's it. Right. So that is it for how neurons work, how they generate an action potential, how they generate an all or none response, how on a molecular level, how do you get a depolarization and a repolarization of a particular part of a neuron membrane. And that matters because that's what propagates a signal. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't propagate a signal. That's the none part of all or none, of course. Okay, so I will be putting this up, and you can review this. And I got another lecture coming at you pretty soon. Thanks for your attention. Appreciate it. And I will see you soon.